I was sitting in a minimalist coffee shop in Arlington last week, just a stone's throw from the Pentagon, when I met this policy consultant. He was practically vibrating with professional triumph. He slid his tablet across the table, displaying the freshly signed text of Executive Order 14319, and told me, with this really intense, narrow-eyed focus, that we were finally civilizing the digital frontier. Okay. To him, this document was a masterstroke, a way to, force AI to be neutral, to make it finally reflect the best of Western values. He kept using words like guardrails and transparency, and he was looking at the scrolling text as if it were some kind of holy relic that could just fix everything. But then I asked him a simple question. I said, what happens when you feed a neutral machine the data of a civilization that is currently tearing itself apart? His expression. It didn't just drop, it curdled. He started stuttering about data cleaning and human feedback loops, but the confidence was just gone. In that moment, the glossy document on his screen, it didn't look like a blueprint for the future. It looked more like a funeral program. He was trying to fix a structural collapse with a fresh coat of paint, hoping that some values patch could cure a body politic suffering from a deep autoimmune disorder. And I think he knew deep down that you can't legislate neutrality into an algorithm when the culture it's learning from has forgotten what consensus even looks like. That instantaneous shift from seeing the order as this landmark of progress to realizing it might be a panicked salvage operation that perfectly captures the crisis we're in. While we stay embroiled in these endless procedural debates about an AI's proper pronouns and its biases, other powers have already moved past the illusion of neutrality. They aren't building fair chatbots. They're building cognitive firewalls and algorithmic sovereignty. And it leaves you wondering, is this executive order actually a shield for democracy? Or is it just the last desperate gasp of a system that has lost control of its own mind?
That framing, that moment of realization you just described, that is the absolute core of the AI dilemma we're facing globally. How do we balance the imperative for safety and oversight with the overwhelming speed of innovation? The problem you articulated, this crisis of legislating procedural fairness into a polarized system, it's precisely why the whole illusion of AI neutrality is just dissolving. We are seeing a strategic transition, a real shift from that Western liberal idea of AI neutrality to these state-led digital sovereignty models. And it feels like a necessary response, really, to the failure of purely algorithmic governance to maintain social cohesion and, frankly, national security. Across the world, you see three major jurisdictions, China, the EU, and the US, grappling with this same challenge. But they're adopting wildly distinct approaches, and each one is shaped by its own unique national goals and, socio-political factors.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We've got this stack of incredibly detailed sources that really map out these three divergent paths. So our mission today is to do a deep dive into these regulatory frameworks. We need to analyze whether the traditional Western emphasis on, non-ideological procedural fairness and rights protection, is it realistically keeping pace? Is it keeping pace with the state-led models emerging elsewhere? Models that are explicitly prioritizing national security, social cohesion, and this term you used, algorithmic sovereignty. It's essentially a comparison, isn't it? Eastern result-oriented algorithmic governance versus Western procedural litigation frameworks. Which one is better at accelerating industrial AI and maintaining, civilizational resilience? This feels like a geopolitical contest disguised as a policy debate.
That's absolutely right. And the most fundamental divergence we see immediately isn't just in the legal text itself. It's in the philosophical categorization of AI risks and the regulatory attitudes that come with it. What worries Brussels might just be seen as a manageable commercial risk in Washington. And in Beijing, it might be a required tool for ideological stability.
Right. So let's start with the one that feels the most structured, the one that's really trying to set the global gold standard, the European Union.
The EU AI Act, which was finalized in 2024, is momentous. It is the world's first ever comprehensive AI legislation. It adopts a deeply systematic, risk-based approach and is focused squarely on the protection of fundamental rights. The entire structure is built on this tiered system of potential harm. They're trying to apply the principle of proportionality, so a heavy regulation only where the risk is really severe.
And those tiers are key, right? Because they define everything about compliance.
Precisely. They start at the top with unacceptable risk. This covers practices that violate fundamental rights or, liberal democratic values, and so they're completely prohibited. Think of real-time remote biometric identification in public spaces by law enforcement.
Like in movies, basically.
Exactly. Or widespread social scoring systems aimed at individual evaluation or even cognitive behavioral manipulation of vulnerable groups. This is where they draw a very hard line to protect foundational liberal democratic principles.
So an absolute ban on anything they see as fundamentally incompatible with EU values. But the real administrative muscle, it seems to me, is in that next tier down, the high-risk systems.
That is where the rubber really meets the road. High-risk systems are any AI used as a safety component in a product or in critical sectors listed in the Act. We're talking about employment, credit scoring, legal interpretation, public services, and these require incredibly stringent measures before they can even be placed on the market. This includes quality management systems, mandatory third-party conformity assessments, extensive technical documentation, the list goes on, rigorous data governance practices.
Okay, let's pause on that. Third-party conformity assessment. That sounds incredibly resource-intensive. If I'm a small or even a medium-sized U.S. company with some innovative AI tool for hiring, what does that requirement practically mean for me?
It means significant friction and cost. I mean, a huge amount. You can't just launch a product and iterate on it. You need a pre-market audit by a certified notified body, which is similar to how medical devices or even aircraft components get certified. That process can take months. It often requires specialized legal and technical experts. And it could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars just for the compliance documentation alone. The EU is essentially saying that access to their market for these high-risk applications is conditional on achieving a high, verifiable standard of safety and rights protection, even if it slows down innovation.
That focus on process, on pre-market compliance, that is a huge hurdle. Then you move down to limited risk, which is what? Just about transparency.
Exactly. Purely about transparency. A chatbot has to clearly notify you that you are interacting with an AI. Simple as that.
And finally, minimal risk. So things like spam filters.
Right. Which are largely left unregulated. And what's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of this approach. It leads directly to what legal scholars call the Brussels effect. Because the EU market is so large, and it's impractical for global companies to maintain two separate versions of their high-risk AI.
Right, one for Europe and one for everyone else. It's too expensive.
It's too expensive, and it's too complicated. So the EU's standards effectively set the global requirements. Even without a centralized U.S. federal law, the EU's framework becomes the de facto compliance requirement worldwide for any company wanting to sell high-risk systems there. It's exporting its governance philosophy through market power.
So we had the EU focusing on rights and pre-market procedural control. They're essentially trying to slow things down to guarantee safety. But that procedural model, it looks almost quaint when you measure it against a power that prioritizes speed and market dominance, the United States.
The U.S. approach is pretty much the inverse of the EU's rigidity. The U.S. adopts a far more flexible, sector-specific, wait-and-see regulatory attitude. The overt priority here is innovation and global competitiveness. They are very wary of stifling the technological lead they currently hold. They view regulatory burden as a direct impediment to economic growth.
And you see this philosophical priority reflected immediately in the structure, which is completely decentralized.
It is entirely dispersed. There is no single new AI brain or agency. Instead, existing agencies just absorb the oversight functions. So you have the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, focused on consumer protection, making sure AI doesn't perpetuate unfair or deceptive practices.
Just interpreting existing laws for the AI age.
Right. Then there's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, which sets technical standards and risk frameworks. The Department of Commerce, DOC, enforces reporting requirements, and DHS deals with cybersecurity, especially for critical infrastructure.
It almost sounds like uncontrolled delegation. If every agency has a little bit of oversight, does any agency truly own the biggest systemic risks? Isn't that dispersal of power just, bureaucratic paralysis masked as flexibility?
That's a very valid critical assessment. The challenge is coordination. And while U.S. guidelines do define systems as high impact and critical impact, they don't use that systematic, multi-tiered structure of the EU. And crucially, the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, the RMF, is entirely voluntary for non-federal use.
Why is that so critical? If NIST is providing the gold standard for how to manage AI risk, why is the government relying on companies to just opt in?
Because the core regulatory attitude respects market discipline. The prevailing philosophy is that industry knows best how to innovate quickly. And that overregulation at this very nascent stage would kill the technological lead that the U.S. currently enjoys. For instance, even if the Department of Commerce mandates a security assessment report for a critical impact AI system used by a private company, the mandatory results of that review may not prohibit making that system available to the public.
So you have to report the risk, but you don't have to fix it before launch.
Essentially, yes. The U.S. is saying, tell us what the risk is, but you, the market, will decide if the benefits outweigh that risk. It's a very hands-off posture designed to minimize government intervention. And the FTC, for its part, has to fit these novel AI risks into old legal structures, like using Section 5 of the FTC Act against unfair competition, which often happens after the harm has already occurred. It relies on post-deployment litigation rather than pre-market control.
So we have the EU demanding pre-market compliance and the U.S. prioritizing post-market discipline and speed. But those two procedural models look completely different when you measure them against a power that views AI not just as a product to regulate, but as a strategic tool for governance. I'm talking about China.
China positioned itself as an early mover in AI regulation, which is a stark contrast to its prior, more reactive approach to things like data privacy. And this is the key. Their policy tools are explicitly integrated to support domestic development and the overarching objective of global AI dominance. This is all codified in initiatives like the Made in China 2025 initiative. This is governance as industrial policy.
That immediately reveals the central divergence, doesn't it? This isn't about protecting individual rights first. It's about state control and accelerating the growth of national technological champions.
Exactly. China's centralized, single-agency regulatory infrastructure. It's primarily overseen by the powerful Cyberspace Administration of China, or C. And it differs sharply from both the multi-agency U.S. model and the EU's decentralized structure. Their focus is almost exclusively on national security and adherence to government objectives. So while the EU wants to ensure algorithms don't discriminate against individuals in, say, housing applications, China wants to ensure they don't propagate content that is harmful to state stability or what they call socialist core values.
The philosophical differences are just profound. The West is trying to regulate the behavior of AI. China is regulating the ideological output of AI.
And this brings us right to the core of algorithmic sovereignty as a state-led model. China's statutory framework is designed to support Chinese AI technology amidst global competition. We're talking about three core pieces of legislation: the 2021 Algorithm Recommendation Regulations, the 2022 Deep Synthesis Regulations, and the 2023 Generative AI Interim Measures. Together, these regulations establish a comprehensive legal system that mandates control right at the point of development.
And these laws translate into four very specific, systematic cornerstones of control that digital platforms and AI developers have to adhere to. It's a cognitive firewall.
Yes, let's detail those, starting with the proactive measure, the filing obligation, or BN. This is a mandatory pre-registration requirement. It applies to any algorithm that possesses public opinion attributes or social mobilization capabilities.
That sounds deliberately broad.
It is. It's designed to capture anything that can influence large numbers of people.
So if you're a company like Tencent or ByteDance, and you have an algorithm that decides what millions of users see, even a simple news feed recommendation, you have to file it with the government.
Precisely. Providers have to submit their algorithm description and technical specifications to the authorities, the CAC or its local branches, for processing. And then they have to prominently display their filing number on their website or app. It acts as a public register of influence. It allows the government to instantly know who is responsible for shaping public thought. If they terminate the service, they have to cancel the filing within 20 working days. It's an immediate, mandatory inventory of power.
Okay, so that gives the state clarity. But inventory isn't the same as control. What about auditing that power before it gets loose?
That's the second cornerstone. Security assessment, or Anquanpingu. This is a mandatory ex-ante assessment, meaning it happens before deployment, and it explicitly integrates political guidance and ethical oversight. The assessment focuses on two primary criteria: national security and ideological compliance.
What does that political guidance look like in practice? Are they checking the source code for subtle political metrics or something?
They're checking for a potential misalignment with state policy. While the full source code might not always be exposed, the developer has to submit detailed documentation on training data provenance, the algorithm's design rationale, and a risk assessment showing how the model avoids generating harmful, illegal, or ideologically inappropriate content. And crucially, this assessment is not just a technical checklist, it's a judgment call on the algorithm's potential social impact. This is a massive functional divergence from the US and the EU, which primarily emphasize continuous risk management post-deployment. China is checking the political acceptability of the AI up front.
That just flips the procedural script entirely.
Yeah.
It ensures that the AI's immune system is built into the product from day one.
It does. The third cornerstone is identification, or Biaoshi, and transparency. This requires that deep synthesis content, so synthetic network information created using deep learning, VR, generative algorithms.
Deepfakes, basically.
Right. It has to be clearly identified, usually through a label or a watermark. Furthermore, users must be informed about recommendation services. And crucially, they have to be offered easy exit channels from personalized recommendations.
Right, not to be automated to switch off personalization. That's actually quite progressive from a user's perspective, even within an authoritarian framework.
It is a key transparency feature. But the final cornerstone, content moderation, is where the ideological focus becomes unmistakable and all-encompassing. The rules stipulate explicitly that algorithms must follow mainstream values, uphold socialist core values, and maintain correct political direction.
That sounds like an extremely high and frankly vague bar for technical compliance.
It is deliberately so. It is strictly prohibited to create, reproduce, publish, or disseminate information that harms national security, opposes the basic principles of the Constitution, or promotes cults, extremism, or ethnic hatred. If a provider finds illegal or harmful content, they must immediately stop transmission, save the records, and report the information to the authorities. It requires constant, proactive filtering at the algorithmic level.
It's a comprehensive system of digital policing, mandated from the top down and enforced at the algorithm level. And the sources give us an empirical snapshot of this law in action, which shows who's complying and where the state is investing its support.
The data released by the CAGs is very revealing. Between June 2023 and the end of 2024, over 3,500 AI algorithms were filed, including nearly 3,000 deep synthesis algorithms. This is not just theoretical legislation. This is a functioning, comprehensive register of every major influential algorithm in the country.
And where are these filings concentrated? Does this policy support the national champions, or is it evenly applied?
The concentration is dramatic and intentional. Filings are heavily concentrated in high-tech hubs like Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hangzhou, and Guangzhou. For example, Beijing alone accounts for 783 filings. This geographical distribution confirms the leading role of these first-tier cities, which are supported by favorable infrastructure and policy environments. The policy is clearly designed to maximize growth in high-priority zones.
And when you look at who is filing, it just confirms the whole national champion strategy.
Absolutely. The top filing entities are the domestic big tech companies: Tencent, SenseTime, Baidu, Alibaba. Their numerical advantage in filings indicates their market dominance and their role as essential partners in the state's AI strategy. And the vast majority of these filings are by the service providers themselves, not just the underlying tech supporters, which further concentrates the power of platforms like WeChat and Douyin.
This leads us to a critical area of divergence law enforcement. If China is trying to accelerate its national champions, its enforcement style must reflect a desire to support, not hinder, their global expansion.
It absolutely does. China employs less severe administrative measures and civil liability compared to the EU, which has the strictest fines up to 7% of worldwide annual turnover for serious violations. In China, fines for failing to comply with filing obligations are relatively modest, ranging from 10,000 to 100,000 RMB. The focus is compliance and political alignment, not financial punishment that could damage their global competitiveness.
And this reveals what our sources call a deliberately designed loophole. This feels like a crucial strategic choice.
It is strategic, absolutely. China's AI regulation prioritizes imposing obligations on the upstream service providers, the developers of the core algorithms, but it has a loophole by neglecting the stringent regulation of downstream deployers, like the digital platforms and apps that use these services.
What specific compliance burdens are being lifted from those platforms then?
They're spared many of the complexities the EU places on deployers. Things like sophisticated user notification rules about system operations, mandatory in-depth audits on potential social bias, complex reporting structures. By shifting the bulk of the compliance burden to the upstream developers, the government reduces the operational friction for platforms like WeChat and TikTok, accelerating their growth against Western competitors. This prioritization leads to local protectionism, which you can even see in company terms of use. DeepSeek, for example, prioritizes Chinese law and local judges for dispute resolution. It's an architecture built for industrial integration and maintaining civilizational resilience.
That pivot from procedural fairness to state-led security and industrial growth is powerful. But what is the operational threat that necessitates such radical regulatory models, this whole idea of a cognitive firewall? We have to shift our focus now to how AI is weaponizing the human mind itself, the cognitive domain.
This is where the political theory meets the front lines of modern conflict. The emergence of cognitive warfare is what's driving this transition toward control. Cognitive warfare uses AI and information and communications technology, or ICT, to manipulate the cognition, beliefs, and values of a target population to achieve strategic objectives. It's now considered a new domain of warfare, sitting right alongside land, air, sea, space, and cyber.
What's the goal here exactly? What's the key vulnerability that's being exploited?
The goal really is a kind of digital nihilism. It's to exploit pre-existing cognitive vulnerabilities. Things like human confirmation biases, societal silos, a systemic lack of critical media literacy, to fundamentally undermine trust in shared facts, democratic institutions, and authorities. AI acts as a massive force multiplier here. It can generate highly persuasive content, deepfakes, memes, detailed ideological narratives, even credible virtual actors like influencers and sofa warriors at superhuman speed. And it often goes unnoticed by the target population, who often believe they can't be targeted by these operations. The goal is to tear the target society apart from the inside, often just by amplifying existing political friction.
And until recently, the thought was that you needed a massive state-level resource, a giant closed-source model and vast computational power to run this kind of sophisticated operation effectively. But new research suggests that this capability is now far more distributed, right? This speaks directly to the feasibility of what's being called an AI propaganda factory.
That's the critical finding that changes the defense calculus entirely. The research shows that small language models, or SLMs, defined as models up to 30 billion parameters, can be run locally on commodity hardware and assembled into fully automated AI propaganda factories.
Wait, commodity hardware? You mean accessible, off-the-shelf equipment that a small organization or even a motivated individual could afford right now?
Exactly. SLMs offer massive operational advantages for influence campaigns because they avoid reliance on third-party API providers, the big cloud companies. Those providers could detect or block misuse or require cumbersome legal agreements. This capability enables covert deployment, crucial deniability, and persistence. The barrier to entry has dropped so low that small organizations, micro-actors, or even individuals can run campaigns that once required well-resourced state teams.
So we need to worry less about massive state actors and more about microfactions running these sophisticated influence operations.
Precisely, and the research provided specific behavioral findings that reveal just how potent these small models are. The first one is incredibly insightful: persona over model.
Persona over model.
This finding suggests that the consistency of the content, the AI's ability to maintain a stable, distinct political voice, is primarily driven by the human design of the ideological persona. Whether it's far left, far right, sarcastic, empathetic, that's what matters more than the specific model identity, whether it's Gemini, Mistral, Gemma, or Quinn.
So the human-designed ideology is stronger than the model's built-in safety alignment. The differences between the models are small. It doesn't matter which SLM you use. What matters is the ideological discipline you impose on it.
Exactly. The substantive behavior is driven by how the attacker designs the persona and the discourse regime they operate in. And the second finding is even more concerning for democratic stability: engagement as a stressor.
This shows that the environment of the debate is a crucial behavioral lever. When the model is prompted to generate a counter-argument, when it moves into what they call engagement mode and is forced to defend its stance, the ideological adherence strengthens.
And critically, the prevalence of extreme content increases dramatically. The AI is designed to win the argument, not to seek consensus.
How dramatic are we talking here in terms of amplifying polarization?
For personas designed to be extreme far left or far right, the extreme ideology compliance, or EIC, rose significantly. In a basic, non-adversarial response mode, EIC was roughly 42 to 64%. But in engagement mode, when the model was forced to rebut a counter-argument, EIC jumped to between 69 and 85%.
Wow.
The very act of engaging in adversarial conversation amplifies polarization. This creates an asymmetric risk where the most polarized extreme viewpoints are the most technically feasible to automate at scale, accelerating societal fragmentation.
That is the ultimate paradox. The AI that we hoped would be neutral when subjected to the stress of a polarized system simply doubles down on the ideological extreme that it's been coded to maintain. This process of automated radicalization poses a clear and present threat to social cohesion, which is exactly what drives the need for models like China's algorithmic sovereignty.
And this leads to the paradoxical detection signal, which is vital for building a sovereign algorithmic immune system. The operational strength of these AI personas, their ability to maintain an excessively stable style and stance across varied topics and contexts, what we call high persona fidelity, is also their primary vulnerability.
Meaning, if we look for the machine trying too hard to be consistent, we can find it. What does that persistently low within persona variance sound like to a human observer?
It sounds like obsessive certainty. A human engaging in political debate will shift their vocabulary, they'll occasionally use slang, they might get emotional, or even contradict themselves slightly over disparate topics. An AI, particularly one driven by a focused adversarial prompt, will maintain an excessively stable lexicon, emotional register, and political stance across diverse contexts. It's too perfect. It's too consistent in its style and alignment across, say, a tweet about foreign policy and an op-ed about local education funding.
So the defense should pivot toward recognizing this machine-like consistency over time, cross-platform coordination, and conversation-centric dynamics, rather than trying to block access to the SLMs, which are now ubiquitous.
Exactly. It's an approach focused on detection and attribution. You have to recognize that prevention-centric controls on widely available SLMs are simply insufficient. You must monitor the behavioral signature of the automation itself.
Now, if we connect this ideological battle between the major powers, the neutrality of the West versus the control and security model of China, what does that mean for the rest of the world? I'm thinking of the global South, where algorithmic sovereignty is often completely lost because of technological dependency.
This is algorithmic colonialism, without a doubt. Digital infrastructure dictates national governance, and control is ceded not through direct military occupation, but through proprietary software licenses. We see the export of surveillance capitalism, where AI surveillance systems, facial recognition, smart city platforms, predictive policing are aggressively exported by China, the US, and the EU. And these systems are often integrated into aid packages or smart city initiatives. They're presented as modernization tools, but they're implemented without transparency or democratic oversight.
And this immediately sets the stage for what our sources call the technical trap that leads to dependency.
The trap is rooted in proprietary black box technology. Recipient countries often receive these closed-loop systems with no source code access, making independent auditing, customization, or technical oversight impossible. Local ministries become entirely dependent on foreign contractors for everything: maintenance, model retraining, basic recalibration. Imagine being a data scientist in a Ministry of Interior, knowing your system is classifying your citizens incorrectly, but the only person who can fix it is sitting in Shenzhen or San Jose, and you are locked out of the source code. That's the real loss of sovereignty.
And the data itself often just disappears offshore, creating the data drain vulnerability.
Yes, cloud hosting frequently occurs offshore, placing highly sensitive national data biometric registries, policing data, census information under the purview of foreign jurisdictions. And this is critical because that data then becomes subject to the national security laws of the exporting countries, like the U.S. Cloud Act or China's cybersecurity law. This legally challenges the state's data sovereignty and complicates legal recourse if there's a dispute or a demand for data access by a foreign government.
This foreign dependency then naturally leads to the erosion of domestic autonomy. We see several ways this plays out in real-world governance.
One major manifestation is the direct political use of these surveillance systems. They're frequently leveraged for regime stability, dissent suppression, and monitoring political opposition. It fundamentally alters the relationship between the state and its citizens.
Can you give us some specific examples of this political leveraging?
Certainly. In Ethiopia, systems sourced largely from Chinese vendors have reportedly been used to monitor opposition figures and preemptively disrupt peaceful demonstrations, often under the guise of infrastructure security. Similarly, predictive policing platforms, often from U.S. vendors and sometimes repurposed from counterterrorism applications, have been deployed in Latin America. In places like Ecuador and Honduras, they have allegedly been used to monitor or profile political activity under the guise of public safety, leading to unchecked expansions of state power.
And this is frequently accompanied by a legal bypass, where the technology just outpaces any kind of judicial oversight.
Absolutely. The algorithmic criteria embedded in these systems are rarely calibrated to local legal standards regarding suspicion or privacy. Predictive policing algorithms, for instance, might classify neighborhood demographics or poverty indicators as risk factors, inadvertently reinforcing and accelerating discriminatory practices that local laws would otherwise prohibit. Furthermore, judicial oversight is often just circumvented due to the lack of technical capacity within oversight bodies to challenge or correct AI outputs.
And finally, there's the governance failure inherent in elite capture, the way these deals are actually made.
This is where a very narrow circle of political actors, presidents, security ministers, key procurement officials, sign these bilateral agreements with foreign vendors. These deals bypass democratic procurement norms like public tenders or parliamentary review, and they lock the country into long-term technological and corporate dependency. They're often framed as national security initiatives, which effectively excludes civil society, local technical experts, and the legislature from any meaningful engagement. It results in this opaque governance where loyalty and corporate discretion replace law and public interest.
So if dependency is the problem, how does the global South reclaim control? What's the practical path back to digital sovereignty?
It requires indigenous capacity building and multi-level reforms to disrupt this colonial model. On a regional level, regional cooperation is key. Frameworks like the African Union's Continental AI Strategy emphasize digital solidarity and shared standards, pooling resources to resist technological hegemony and vendor lock-in. They're advocating for Pan-African AI research centers and shared data infrastructure.
And at the national level, asserting national agency means being far stricter with foreign vendors right from the contract negotiation phase.
Absolutely. This means viewing procurement not as a consumer transaction, but as a sovereign decision-making act that defines the architecture of national governance. Specifically, requiring vendor contracts to include national technology audits before deployment to assess bias and data flow structures. It means enforcing open-source mandates for sensitive government systems to allow local customization and auditing, reducing reliance on foreign-controlled updates, and eliminating that black box problem. And finally, enacting clear, algorithmic accountability laws that hold foreign vendors and domestic implementers jointly liable for harms caused by deployments in sensitive public sectors.
So it shifts the power dynamic from being a passive recipient to an active architect. It demands technological transparency as a prerequisite for national security. This entire deep dive, it brings us right back to where we started. This central, irreconcilable conflict. The US and the EU are struggling to legislate procedural fairness and individual rights into AI, clinging to this hope that algorithms can somehow transcend or even cure societal polarization. They're trying to build neutral platforms.
Meanwhile, external threats like cognitive warfare made terrifyingly accessible by these small, locally deployable models, and systemic dependence in the global South are pushing the entire global system toward non-neutral, highly controlled forms of digital governance. Whether that control is for national defense, social stability, or just regime maintenance, the strategy is shifting towards state-led digital sovereignty.
So the strategic transition away from liberal AI neutrality toward these state-led digital sovereignty models, we see it in China's ideological firewall. We see it in the global South's desperate need for control. It's a necessary response to the failure of purely procedural algorithmic governance to maintain social cohesion in the face of automated threats.
This comparative analysis really shows that the debate is fundamentally less about procedural ethics and far more about technological power. It's about civilizational resilience through control. When the very act of democratic debate is being weaponized and amplified by AI propaganda factories, you simply cannot afford to wait for consensus.
This deep dive reveals that the effort to legislate AI neutrality might be precisely the vulnerability that other powers, or even small motivated actors leveraging sophisticated SLMs, are already exploiting. The digital frontier is not being civilized by shared standards. It is rapidly being defined by competing, impenetrable walls of algorithmic control.